September 1916. A cattle truck rattles through the English countryside, carrying 73 German prisoners of war toward an unknown fate. Inside, Friedrich Weber sits with his back against the wooden wall, trying to control his breathing. 24 years old, a clerk from Hamburg before the war, captured 3 weeks ago at the Somme after his unit was overrun. He spent those 3 weeks in a temporary holding camp in France, sleeping on mud, eating scraps, waiting to be processed. Now they're taking him to England, to the enemy's heartland, and everyone knows what that means. The propaganda had been clear. The British are barbarians who bayonet prisoners, who starve captured soldiers, who torture men for information. Weber has spent 3 weeks preparing himself to die, trying to find some dignity in the prospect of martyral death for the fatherland. But he's also spent 3 weeks being hungry, being cold, being terrified, and the closer they get to whatever camp awaits them, the more his preparation crumbles into simple, animal fear. He's not alone. Around him in the cattle truck, his fellow prisoners sit in silence. Some pray, some stare at nothing. One man, Kaufmann, keeps muttering the same phrase over and over. They're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. No one tells him to stop, because they're all thinking the same thing. The truck slows, stops. The door slides open, flooding the interior with late afternoon sunlight. British soldiers stand outside, rifles ready. An officer with a clipboard steps forward. "Out," he says in accented German. "Line up. No sudden movements." They file out, blinking in the brightness. Weber's legs shake from 3 weeks of poor food and the cramped journey. Around him, he can see other prisoners stumbling, some falling. The British soldiers don't shoot them, don't even raise their rifles, just wait patiently while the Germans organize themselves into a ragged line. Weber looks around. They're in what appears to be farmland, rolling hills, green fields, stone buildings in the distance, nothing that looks like a concentration camp. Nothing that looks like a place of execution. The British officer consults his clipboard. "Welcome to England," he says, still in German. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will not be harmed if you follow camp regulations. You will be fed, housed, and given medical attention as needed." Kaufmann laughs. It's a high, desperate sound. "Lies," he says in German. "More lies." The British officer looks at him. "I understand you don't believe me," he says quietly. "I wouldn't either in your position. But you'll see. Come, your barracks are ready." They march into the camp, and Weber, expecting hell, walks into something he can't process, something that doesn't match anything he was told. He walks into barracks that have beds, real beds, with mattresses and blankets, into a dining hall where hot food is being prepared, into a camp where British soldiers are working alongside German prisoners on construction projects, not as guards torturing captives, but as men doing a job. He walks into a place where, against everything he'd been promised, he might survive. But survival, Weber would learn, came with a different kind of torment, not the physical torture he'd prepared for, but something far more complicated. The slow realization that everything he'd been told about the enemy was a lie, and that if they'd lied about this, what else had they lied about? What else had he believed that was false? What had he done in the name of those lies? Friedrich Weber was born in Hamburg in 1892. His father worked in the port, managing cargo manifests. His mother kept house and raised 4 children. Weber was the eldest. Had 2 younger sisters and a brother. Before the war, he'd been training as an accountant, good with numbers, meticulous, the kind of young man who wore a suit to work and carried his lunch in a tin pail and had a sensible plan for his future. Marriage to his childhood sweetheart, Greta, children, a house near his parents, a quiet, ordinary life. Then August 1914 arrived. The declarations of war, the mobilization, the fever that swept through Germany just as it had through Britain and France. Young men volunteering by the thousands, afraid the war would end before they could participate, before they could prove themselves, before they could be part of something glorious. Weber enlisted with his friends. They joined together, trained together, shipped to the Western Front together. By 1916, most of those friends were dead. The glory had revealed itself to be mud and gas and machine guns. The great adventure had become grinding survival. Weber had killed men. He didn't know how many. In battle, you aimed at movement, at shapes in smoke, at anything that might be the enemy. Sometimes the shapes fell. Sometimes they didn't. You learned not to think about it too carefully. Learned to build walls in your mind between the man you were and the soldier you had to be. He'd also seen terrible things. Watched friends die in ways that would wake him screaming for years. Been buried alive twice by shell explosions. Developed the permanent shake in his hands that would never fully go away. Become someone his mother wouldn't recognize. And he'd believed what he was told to believe. That the British were monsters. That they bayoneted wounded. That capture meant torture and death. That showing mercy to the enemy was the same as betraying Germany. Now he stood in a British POW camp, holding a metal bowl of hot soup, and nothing made sense anymore. The camp was Dorchester, in southern England, one of dozens of camps established across Britain to house the growing number of German POWs. By late 1916, there were over 30,000 German prisoners in British custody. By war's end, there would be over 300,000. The British government faced a problem. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, but British public opinion was viciously anti-German. Propaganda had done its work. Germans were Huns, barbarians, baby killers. The idea of treating them well infuriated many Britons whose sons were dying in French trenches. But the government also worried about retaliation. British soldiers were being captured on the Western Front. If Britain mistreated German POWs, Germany would mistreat British POWs. It was a delicate balance. Satisfy public bloodlust while protecting British prisoners through reciprocal decent treatment. The result was a system that, compared to what German prisoners expected, seemed almost unbelievably humane. Weber's first morning in Dorchester camp, he woke to the sound of a bell. Not a harsh alarm, but a gentle ringing indicating breakfast. He'd spent the night in actual sleep, in an actual bed, for the first time in months. His body ached from the luxury of it, muscles unaccustomed to anything but frozen ground or wooden planks. He filed to the dining hall with the other new arrivals. They moved like men walking to execution, tensed for violence. But violence didn't come. Instead, they got porridge. Hot porridge with milk and sugar, bread with butter, tea, actual tea with actual sugar. More food than Weber had seen in a single meal since leaving Germany. He ate slowly, waiting for the trick, waiting for someone to snatch it away, to reveal this was mockery before punishment. But the British guards just stood by the walls, smoking cigarettes, looking bored. Kaufmann, sitting beside Weber, ate like a starving animal, shoveled food into his mouth with shaking hands. Halfway through he stopped, looked at his bowl, and started crying. "What's wrong?" Weber asked quietly in German. "They're fattening us up," Kaufmann whispered. "For something. This is how you fatten livestock before slaughter." An older prisoner across the table, a sergeant named Hartmann, who'd been in the camp for 3 months, shook his head. "No," he said. "This is just how they feed prisoners here. Every day, 3 meals a day. This isn't special. This is normal." Kaufmann stared at him. "That's impossible." "I thought so too," Hartmann said. "For the first week, I didn't eat. Thought it was poisoned or drugged or a trick. But it's not. They just feed us, like the Geneva Convention says they should." Weber found his voice. "What about the torture, the executions?" Hartmann looked at him with something like pity. "There isn't any. I know what we were told. I believed it too. But it's not true. The worst thing they do here is make you follow camp regulations and assign you to work details. That's it. The room was silent, except for the sound of men eating. 73 German prisoners, slowly realizing that everything they'd been prepared for wasn't going to happen. And somehow, that realization was almost as terrifying as the torture they'd expected. The routine of camp life established itself with surprising speed. Morning bell at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignments at 7:30, lunch at noon, more work until 5, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 9. The work varied. Some prisoners were assigned to farm labor on nearby estates, helping bring in harvests. Others worked on camp maintenance, repairing buildings, or tending the camp garden. A few with specialized skills were sent to local businesses, working as carpenters or mechanics under supervision. Weber, with his background in accounting, was assigned to the camp administrative office. He helped maintain records, track supplies, manage the complicated logistics of feeding and housing thousands of prisoners. It meant working alongside British soldiers, sitting in an office with men whose comrades were killing his comrades across the channel, men who should hate him. The first day, he was introduced to Corporal Davies, a Welsh clerk who would supervise his work. Davies was 42, too old for front-line service, assigned to home guard duties. He had a bad leg from a mining accident years before, walked with a cane, spoke slowly and carefully, trying to be understood by someone whose English was rudimentary. "You'll be helping with supply inventories," Davies explained, pointing to ledgers, "recording what comes in, what goes out, making sure the numbers balance. I'm told you're good with numbers?" Weber nodded stiffly. "Yes." "Good, because I'm terrible with them. Always have been. Drives me mad, all these columns and figures." Davies smiled. It seemed genuine. "I suspect you'll be better at this than I am, which is embarrassing for me, but helpful for the work." Weber didn't know how to respond. This man was the enemy, but he was also just a middle-aged clerk with bad knees, complaining about arithmetic. It didn't fit. Nothing fit. Over the following weeks, Weber learned the rhythms of camp life, learned which guards were strict and which were easygoing, learned that following regulations meant being left largely alone, learned that the rumors of torture and execution were indeed just rumors. But he also learned something more unsettling. He learned that many of the British guards were decent men, that some of them didn't particularly want to be at war, that they had families and worries and ordinary human concerns, that in short, they were not the monsters he'd been told about. Corporal Davies, for instance, had 2 daughters, showed Weber their photographs one day during a slow afternoon in the office. Margaret, 17, working in a munitions factory. Penny, 15, still in school, but planning to join the nursing service when she turned 16. "I worry about Margaret," Davies said. "The factory work is dangerous. Explosives, you know. One wrong move and—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Weber found himself saying, "My sisters are younger. Anna is 14. Clara is 11. I worry about them too. There's not enough food in Germany now. The blockade—" He stopped, realizing he'd just admitted to the enemy that Germany was suffering from Britain's naval blockade, had just shared personal information, had just had a moment of common humanity with someone he was supposed to hate. Davies nodded sympathetically. "War's hard on families. On all families, German or British, the ones doing the fighting and the ones waiting at home." Later, back in his barracks, Weber lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling. Tried to reconcile the propaganda with the reality. Tried to understand how the same nation that was starving Germany could also feed its prisoners 3 meals a day. How the same army that was killing Germans in France could treat German prisoners with basic decency in England. Nothing made sense. And the not making sense was almost worse than torture would have been. because torture he could have understood. Hatred he could have met with hatred. But this, kindness from the enemy, humanity from those he'd been told were inhuman, this broke something inside him that he didn't know how to fix. By December 1916, Weber had been in Dorchester camp for 3 months. He'd settled into the routine, gotten better at English through daily interaction with Davies and the other office staff, learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of prison camp life. The camp now housed over 2,000 German prisoners. They were divided roughly into 3 groups: the regulars, career soldiers who maintained strict military discipline even in captivity; the conscripts, men like Weber who'd been ordinary citizens before the war and just wanted to survive it; and the resistors, a smaller group who refused to cooperate, who saw any interaction with the British as betrayal, who made trouble when they could. Weber fell solidly in the conscript category. He did his work, followed regulations, kept his head down, but he also started noticing things, started seeing the camp not through the lens of fear and propaganda, but through the more complicated lens of reality. He noticed, for instance, that prisoners who worked on farms often came back with extra food. Farmers would share their lunch with the work crews, would give them apples from orchards or fresh bread from farmhouse kitchens, would treat them not as dangerous enemies, but as additional labor during wartime shortage. He noticed that some prisoners had become friendly with their guards, would sit and smoke together during breaks, would exchange photographs of families, would, in small ways, become something other than captor and captive. He noticed that mail from Germany was delivered regularly, that prisoners could write letters home, though they were censored, that the Red Cross visited periodically to ensure conditions met international standards, that when prisoners got sick, they received the same medical treatment as British soldiers. In short, he noticed that the British were following the rules, were treating prisoners the way the Geneva Convention required, were being, by the standards of 1916, remarkably civilized about the whole business of warehousing enemy soldiers. And this created a profound dissonance. Because if Britain was following the rules, being humane, treating prisoners well, then what did that say about Germany? About the propaganda he'd believed? About the things he'd done in the name of fighting monsters who turned out to be men? Christmas 1916 arrived. Weber expected the day to be like any other, perhaps harder, being away from home during the holiday. He thought of his family in Hamburg, wondered if they had enough coal for heat, enough food for a Christmas dinner, if they'd received the letter he'd sent 2 weeks earlier. Instead, Christmas in Dorchester camp was festive. The British command had decided that keeping prisoner morale up was easier than dealing with depressed, angry men. So they organized Christmas celebrations, distributed extra rations, allowed prisoners to organize concerts and performances. Someone had fashioned a Christmas tree from branches and scraps. It stood in the dining hall, decorated with paper stars and whatever bits of color prisoners could scrounge. It looked nothing like the grand trees Weber remembered from childhood Christmases in Hamburg. But it was something, an attempt at normalcy in an abnormal situation. The British cooks prepared a special meal: roast pork with vegetables, plum pudding for dessert, beer, actual beer distributed to prisoners old enough to drink. It wasn't lavish by peacetime standards, but compared to frontline rations or the near-starvation conditions in Germany, it was a feast. Sergeant Hartmann, sitting across from Weber during dinner, shook his head in disbelief. "I've eaten better in this prison camp than I did in the German army, than my family's eating in Berlin right now. How is that possible? We're supposed to be the prisoners. We're supposed to be suffering." "Maybe," said Muller, another clerk from the office. "They want us to be grateful, want us to be compliant. Happy prisoners are easier to manage than angry ones." "Maybe," Hartmann agreed. "But they're still feeding us, still treating us like humans. Whatever the motive, the result is the same. We're better off here than we were fighting. Better off here than our families are at home." The words hung in the air, because they were true, and that truth was devastating. Later that evening, there was a concert. Prisoners with musical talent had formed a small orchestra: violin, accordion, trumpet, and improvised percussion. They played German folk songs, Christmas carols, pieces by Bach and Beethoven. The British guards stood at the edges of the hall and listened. When the orchestra finished, silent night, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. German prisoners weeping for homes they might never see again. British guards with their own emotions, carefully controlled, thinking of their own families, their own comrades in France, the absurdity of standing in a hall listening to the enemy's music and finding it beautiful. Corporal Davies found Weber after the concert. "That was lovely," he said quietly. "Music's one of those things that crosses borders, isn't it? Shows we're not so different." Weber nodded, not trusting his voice. "I know this must be hard," Davies continued, "being away from home at Christmas. I wanted you to know. I sent a letter to the Red Cross about you, confirming you're here, healthy, being treated well. They'll forward it to your family, so they'll know." Weber stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Davies looked surprised by the question. "Because it's the right thing to do. Your family's worried. My girls would be worried if it were me. It's a small thing, but it might give them some peace." That night, Weber couldn't sleep. Lay in his bed in the barracks, listening to the sounds of 2,000 men breathing, snoring, occasionally crying in their sleep. Thought about Corporal Davies making sure a German prisoner's family knew he was alive. Thought about British farmers sharing food with German work crews. Thought about Christmas dinner and concerts and decent treatment. Thought about the fact that he was safer, healthier, and better fed as a prisoner in England than he'd been as a soldier in Germany's army, and wondered what that said about everything he'd believed. Spring 1917 brought changes. The war ground on. Casualties mounted. The prison population grew. More camps opened across Britain to handle the influx. But at Dorchester, routines continued. Weber worked in the office, his English now fluent enough for complex tasks. He'd become genuinely useful to the administrative staff, could spot errors in supply records that British clerks missed, could handle correspondence with German-speaking contacts, had, in short, become valuable. This created its own problems, because valuable prisoners were prisoners the British wanted to keep. And Weber was starting to realize that he didn't particularly want to leave. The thought horrified him. He was German, a German soldier. His duty was to escape, to return to Germany, to rejoin the fight. That's what the military code demanded. That's what honor required. But the idea of returning to the war filled him with dread. The trenches, the mud, the gas, the random violence that could kill you for no reason, beyond being in the wrong spot at the wrong moment. The officers who treated soldiers like ammunition, the propaganda that called it glorious. Here, in this prison camp in England, he woke up each morning knowing he'd probably still be alive that night. Ate regular meals, did work that used his skills, had conversations with people who treated him like a human being. Was it wrong to prefer that? Was it cowardice? Betrayal? These questions ate at him, but they also opened a larger question. What was he fighting for in the first place? In June 1917, a new group of prisoners arrived. Among them was a young soldier named Richter, captured during the Messines Ridge offensive. He was 20 years old, had been at the front for 6 weeks before capture, was traumatized in the specific way of men who'd seen too much too fast. Weber was assigned to help process the new arrivals, explaining camp rules, distributing supplies. When Richter's turn came, the young man could barely speak, just stood there shaking, eyes vacant. Weber recognized the look. He'd seen it in mirrors. "It's all right," he said gently in German. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here. Richter focused on him slowly. Safe? Yes. This is a prisoner of war camp. They follow the Geneva Convention. You'll be fed, housed, given medical care if you need it. It's not perfect, but it's not the front. But they're the enemy, Richter said, confused. They'll torture us. No, Weber interrupted. They won't. I know what we were told. I believed it too. But it's not true. They'll treat you correctly. Better than correctly, actually. Better than we were treated by our own army. Richter stared at him. That's not possible. I know, but it's true anyway. Over the following weeks, Weber watched Richter adapt to camp life, watched him slowly relax, watched the 1,000-yard stare fade as regular food and sleep and safety worked their healing, watched him become less a traumatized soldier and more a young man who might have a future. It was like watching himself 6 months earlier, and it made Weber realize how much he'd changed, how completely his understanding of the war had transformed. He'd gone from believing Britain was evil to recognizing it was just another country with ordinary people. He'd gone from seeing British soldiers as monsters to seeing them as men doing a job they mostly didn't want to do. He'd gone from patriotic certainty to profound confusion about what he'd been fighting for. And most disturbing of all, he'd gone from wanting to escape to dreading the day he might be repatriated. In August 1917, the camp administration announced a new program. Prisoners with agricultural skills could volunteer for work on farms, experiencing labor shortages. These prisoners would live on the farms during harvest season, working alongside British farmers and their families under minimal supervision. The announcement caused controversy in the camp. The resistors called it collaboration, said that anyone who volunteered was betraying Germany, that working to help Britain's economy was the same as fighting for Britain. But for many prisoners, especially those from farming backgrounds, the opportunity was irresistible. A chance to leave the camp, even temporarily, to do work they knew and valued, to be around growing things and animals instead of wire and guards. Weber, despite having no agricultural background, considered volunteering, not for the work, but for the experience, for the chance to see more of England, to understand better these people who'd become his captors, and increasingly, something more complicated than enemies. In the end, he didn't volunteer. Told himself it was because he was needed in the office. But truthfully, he was afraid. Afraid of what he might find. Afraid of liking these people more than he already did. Afraid of the implications of that liking. But he heard the stories from those who went. They came back full of tales of farm families who treated them like hired help rather than dangerous prisoners, of children who were curious rather than afraid, of meals shared at farmhouse tables, of farmers' wives who packed extra food for them to bring back to camp. One prisoner, Hoffman, had worked at a farm in Kent, came back almost giddy with the experience. The farmer's name was Thomas, he told a group in the barracks. He had 3 sons. 2 are in France with the British Army. The third is too young, still helps run the farm. Thomas and I worked side by side for 6 weeks, bringing in the wheat harvest. And, someone prompted, and on the last day, he paid me, actual money, said it was wrong not to pay a man for honest work, prisoner or not. Then he shook my hand and said I'd be welcome back if the war ever ended and I wanted to visit. Silence. Then Kaufmann, who still struggled with camp life, said bitterly, "He was mocking you. Surely you see that." "No," Hoffman said quietly. "He wasn't. He meant it. I could tell." More silence. Because if Hoffman was right, if these British farmers were showing genuine kindness to German prisoners, what did that mean about everything? The war continued. 1917 became 1918. Casualties mounted into the millions. Empires began to crack under the strain. Revolution in Russia, mutinies in the French army, America entering the war, Germany launching desperate offensives. But in Dorchester camp, life continued in its strange parallel track. regular meals, routine work, the slow transformation of enemy soldiers into something else. Not British, never British, but not quite enemy anymore either. Weber turned 26 in camp, received a package from his family, his first contact in nearly a year. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small cake his mother had somehow managed to bake despite shortages. The letters told of hardship. Food rationing had become severe. His father had been conscripted into labor service despite his age. His sisters were working in factories. His brother, just 16, was training for military service. They asked him questions. What was it like in England? Was he being treated well? Did he have enough food? When did he think the war would end? He wrote back carefully, knowing the letters would be censored by both British and German authorities, told them he was healthy, fed, working in an office, treated according to international law, didn't tell them he was treated better than he'd been in the German army, didn't tell them about Christmas concerts and British guards who showed photographs of their daughters, didn't tell them he was starting to dread repatriation. Some things couldn't be written. Some truths were too complicated for letters. In June 1918, the Spanish flu arrived in Britain. It would kill more people worldwide than the war itself. 20 to 50 million dead. Among them, soldiers and prisoners in close quarters were particularly vulnerable. Dorchester camp was hit hard. Within 2 weeks, over 300 prisoners were sick. 15 died. The British medical staff worked around the clock, treating German prisoners with the same urgency and care as they would British soldiers. Weber caught it in the second wave, remembered very little of the illness itself. Fever dreams, chills, coughing that felt like it would tear him apart, drifting in and out of consciousness in the camp infirmary. What he did remember was Corporal Davies sitting beside his bed, reading to him during the worst of the fever, keeping watch, making sure the medical staff checked on him regularly. When Weber finally recovered enough to speak, he asked weakly, "Why?" Davies looked surprised. "Why what? Why did you—" Weber gestured vaguely. "You could have been infected, could have brought it home to your daughters. Why risk that for a prisoner?" Davies was quiet for a moment, then said, "Because you're a person. You're not just a prisoner or a German or an enemy. You're a person." Friedrich Weber, 26 years old, from Hamburg, good with numbers, writes letters to his sisters. "You're a person, and I couldn't just let you die alone if there was something I could do to help." Weber turned his face away, because he was crying, and because he'd just received a kindness he didn't know how to process. From a man who, 3 years earlier, he'd been prepared to kill if they'd met in battle. The flu passed. Those who survived it were changed, not just physically weakened, but psychologically marked. They'd come close to death and been pulled back, often by the care of people who had no obligation to care, who could have let them die and faced no consequences. It made everything more complicated. In October 1918, news filtered into the camp that Germany was losing. The Great Spring Offensive had failed. Allied forces were advancing. The German lines were crumbling. Revolution was stirring at home. The prisoners reacted in different ways. Some were devastated, seeing their sacrifice rendered meaningless. Some were relieved, hoping it meant the war would finally end. Some were in denial, insisting the reports were British propaganda. Weber felt numb. He'd been a prisoner for over 2 years, had almost died of influenza, had spent 24 months eating regular meals, doing useful work, being treated like a human being. The war had become something distant, something that happened in another world. The thought of returning to Germany filled him with complicated emotions. He wanted to see his family, wanted to go home. But what was home now? A country ravaged by war, a nation that had believed lies, a place where he'd be expected to celebrate martial values he no longer believed in. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. The war was over. In Dorchester camp, the announcement was met with silence. German prisoners stood in the yard, hearing the news, and didn't know how to react. Cheer? Mourn? After 4 years of slaughter, after millions dead, what was the appropriate response to peace? Weber stood with them, equally lost. The war was over. He'd survived, but he'd survived as a prisoner of the enemy. What did that make him? Hero or coward? Survivor or collaborator? The British Guards seemed similarly uncertain. They weren't jubilant. They were tired. Relieved, yes, but also exhausted by 4 years of watching the world tear itself apart. Corporal Davies found Weber later that day. "I suppose you'll be going home soon," he said. "They'll start repatriation processes. Probably take a few months with everything in chaos, but you'll be back in Hamburg by spring, I'd imagine." Weber nodded. "Yes, I suppose so. You don't sound happy about it." "I am. Of course I am. I'll see my family, my home. I've been dreaming of that for 2 years. "But," Davies prompted. Weber struggled to find words. "But I don't know what I'm going home to. Germany's not the same country I left. I'm not the same person who left. And I've spent 2 years here, learning that everything I was told was lies. How do I go back? How do I fit into a place that I now know was built on lies?" Davies nodded slowly. "I don't know. That's a fair question. I don't have an answer." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Davies said, "For what it's worth, you've been a good worker, a decent man. I've been glad to know you. I wish circumstances had been different, that we'd met as colleagues rather than guard and prisoner. But I've learned from knowing you, learned that the enemy is just people. That seems obvious, but until you meet them, until you work alongside them, it's easy to forget." "I've learned the same," Weber said quietly. "I came here expecting to be tortured and killed. Instead I was fed, housed, treated like a human being, by people I'd been told were monsters. I don't know what to do with that knowledge, but I can't unlearn it." "No," Davies agreed. "You can't. And maybe that's good. Maybe if enough men on both sides learn that lesson, we won't be stupid enough to do this again." Weber wanted to believe that, wanted to think the war had taught humanity something. But he'd seen too much, understood too much about how propaganda worked, how easily people could be led to hate. "I hope you're right," he said. But he didn't believe it. Repatriation took longer than expected. Germany was in chaos. Revolution, then counter-revolution. The Kaiser in exile. A new government forming. Food shortages even worse than during the war. No infrastructure to handle the millions of soldiers, prisoners, and displaced people trying to return home. So the prisoners waited. Through winter, 1918, 1919. Through spring, still living in camps, still fed by the British, still in limbo between war and peace. During those months, something strange happened. Some prisoners didn't want to leave. It started with small things. Men who'd been working on farms, asking if they could stay on as hired labourers. Men with skills asking if there were jobs in Britain they could fill. Men who'd formed friendships with guards or local families asking about immigration procedures. At first, the British authorities said no. These were prisoners of war. They had to be repatriated. It was in the treaties. But as the situation in Germany deteriorated, as reports came back of starvation and chaos, the rules began to bend. By summer 1919, the British government quietly allowed some German prisoners to remain. Those with skills Britain needed. Those who'd married British women. Those who could demonstrate they faced persecution in Germany. Not many. Perhaps a few thousand out of 300,000. But enough to be noticed. Enough to cause scandal. German newspapers raged about traitors who'd chosen to stay with the enemy. British newspapers worried about German infiltration. Politicians on both sides demanded investigations. But the men themselves, the ones who stayed, had their own reasons. And Weber understood those reasons, because he shared them. In July 1919, Weber received his repatriation orders. He'd be on a ship back to Germany in August, back to Hamburg, back to his family, back to whatever life he could build in the ruins of the war. Corporal Davies came to see him the day before he left, brought a small package. "For your journey," he said. "Some food, some tobacco, not much, but it might help." "Thank you," Weber said. Then, because he had to know, "Why did you do this? All of it? You were kind to me from the first day, went beyond what duty required. Why?" Davies thought for a moment. "My older son, Thomas, he's in the army, was captured by Germans in 1917. I got a letter from the Red Cross 6 months later saying he was alive, in a POW camp near Cologne, being treated well." He looked at Weber. "I don't know if it's true. Don't know if he really is being treated well, but I wanted to believe it. And I thought, if he is, maybe it's because some German guard decided to be decent, decided to treat prisoners like human beings. So I tried to be that person, tried to be the guard I hoped was taking care of my son." Weber felt his throat tighten. "What happened to him? Your son?" "Don't know. War ended. Haven't heard yet. Repatriation's slow from Germany too, but I'm hoping, praying, that he'll come home." "I hope so too," Weber said, and meant it. The next day, Weber boarded a ship at Southampton, joined hundreds of other German prisoners being repatriated, watched the English coast disappear behind them. Most of the men on the ship were celebrating, going home, finally going home after years of captivity. But Weber felt conflicted. He was glad to see his family, terrified of what he'd find, grateful for his survival, guilty about the conditions that allowed it, angry at the lies he'd been told, confused about what he believed now. The journey took 3 days. When they arrived at Hamburg port, the city was barely recognizable. Buildings damaged by food riots, people thin and desperate, an atmosphere of defeat and anger and shame. Weber's family met him at the dock, his mother, looking 20 years older than when he'd left, his father, hunched and grey, his sisters, now young women, hardened by work and war. His brother, the one who'd been training for military service, was missing, had died in the last month of the war, age 16. They hugged, wept, took him home to an apartment that was cold and nearly bare of furniture, sold piece by piece for food. That night, lying in his childhood bed, Weber stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of his life. He'd gone to war believing in Germany's cause, been captured believing he'd be tortured, survived because the enemy treated prisoners decently, learned that everything he'd been told was lies, come home to find Germany shattered, his brother dead, his family starving. What had any of it been for? He had no answer, only questions, and the knowledge that he'd been treated better by the enemy than by his own government, that he'd eaten better as a British prisoner than his family had eaten in Germany, that he'd found more humanity in a prison camp than in the army he'd served. These truths were impossible to voice. Who would believe him? Who would understand? In defeated Germany, there was no patience for complexity, only anger at betrayal, certainty that they'd been stabbed in the back, determination to believe anything except that the war had been waste and horror and lies. So Weber kept his truths to himself, got a job, tried to rebuild, married Greta, who'd waited for him despite everything, had children, built a quiet life. But he never forgot. Never forgot Corporal Davies sitting by his bed during the flu. Never forgot Christmas dinner in a prison camp. Never forgot British farmers treating him like hired help instead of dangerous enemy. Never forgot the kindness that shouldn't have been possible but was. In the 1930s, as Germany rearmed, as new propaganda began, as old hatreds were rekindled, Weber watched with horror. He saw it coming, saw the lies being told again, saw people believing those lies because believing was easier than questioning. He tried to speak up, tried to tell people that he'd been a prisoner in Britain, that the British weren't monsters, that war was neither glorious nor necessary, but no one wanted to hear it. He was dismissed as a defeatist, as someone corrupted by the enemy, as a traitor. When World War II began in 1939, Weber was 47, too old for military service. Watched from Hamburg as the city was bombed, as Germany repeated all the mistakes of the previous war, as another generation was fed into the machine. His son, born in 1921, was conscripted in 1940, sent to fight in France, then Russia. Wrote letters home that reminded Weber of his own letters from 1914, full of false bravery and carefully hidden fear. Weber wrote back, tried to tell his son the truth about war, about enemies being human, about propaganda being lies. But the letters were censored. His son never received them, or if he did, never believed them. In 1943, Weber's son died on the Eastern Front, aged 22, the same age Weber had been when he was captured. Weber survived the war, survived the bombing of Hamburg in 1943 that killed 40,000 people in a single night, survived the chaos of Germany's defeat, survived the occupation, lived to see Germany divided, then eventually reunified. He lived until 1989, died at age 97, one of the last veterans of the First World War. His grandchildren, who'd grown up in peaceful, prosperous West Germany, had always been curious about his war experiences. He told them some things, the basics, that he'd been a soldier, been captured, spent time in a British prison camp, come home after the war. But it wasn't until his final weeks, dying in a hospital in Hamburg, that he told them the truth. About expecting torture and finding decency. About Corporal Davies and Christmas concerts and working in an office alongside the enemy. About being treated better by his captors than by his own army. About coming home and finding his family starving while he'd been well fed in a prison camp. His grandson, a university student, asked the question Weber had been waiting decades to hear. Did it change you, knowing that the enemy was just people? Weber nodded weakly. It destroyed me, he said quietly, and rebuilt me. I couldn't hate anymore, couldn't believe in simple stories about good and evil, couldn't send young men to war knowing what I knew about what war really was. But no one listened. No. People want simple stories, want to believe in evil enemies and righteous causes. The truth, that we're all just people, scared and confused and trying to survive. That's too complicated, too uncomfortable. His grandson was quiet for a moment. Then, but you kept the truth anyway, even when no one believed you. I had to, Weber said, because I owed it to Corporal Davies, to the British Guards who could have been cruel and weren't, to the farmers who shared food, to everyone who showed mercy when they could have shown hatred. He paused, struggling for breath. I was supposed to hate them. They were supposed to hate me, but we didn't. And that small fact, that refusal to hate, that's the only good thing I took from that war, the only truth worth keeping. Friedrich Weber died 3 days later. At his funeral, his family found a letter in his effects, written in English, from Corporal Davies, dated 1920. The letter had arrived in Hamburg a year after Weber's return. He'd never mentioned it to anyone, but he'd kept it for 69 years. It read, Dear Friedrich, I hope this letter finds you well, and that you've been reunited with your family in good health. I wanted to write to tell you that my son Thomas came home last month. He'd been held in a POW camp near Hanover. He tells me he was treated well, fed properly, given medical care when he needed it, treated in short, much as I tried to treat you. I don't know if the guard who looked after Thomas was motivated by the same hope I had, that someone was doing the same for his own son. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that kindness happened, that in the middle of a war built on hatred, ordinary men chose mercy. I wanted you to know this. Wanted you to know that the kindness you received wasn't unique, that perhaps, in some small way, our treatment of each other mattered, made a difference. I also wanted to say thank you. You were a good worker, a decent man, and you helped me remember something I might have forgotten in wartime, that the enemy is just people. That seems obvious now in peace, but it wasn't always obvious during the war. I hope Germany recovers. I hope you find work and peace and happiness. I hope we never have to do this again. Go to war, kill each other's children, pretend we're enemies when we're just people. Take care of yourself, Friedrich. And if you ever find yourself in Wales, you'd be welcome at my table. Your friend, Daniel Davies. Weber's grandson read the letter at the funeral. There wasn't a dry eye in the church, because here, finally, was proof that the kindness Weber had spoken of was real, that enemies had become friends, that mercy had existed in the middle of war. After the funeral, Weber's grandson did something that would have made his grandfather proud. He researched Corporal Daniel Davies, found that he died in 1968, survived by 3 daughters and 2 sons, found his family in Wales, and he travelled there, brought the letter, met Davies' grandchildren, told them the story of how their grandfather had treated a German prisoner with kindness, how that kindness had mattered to one man for 70 years. Davies' granddaughter wept. He never talked about the war much, she said, but when he did, he'd say that he tried to remember everyone was human. That seemed like such a simple thing. But reading this, knowing it mattered to someone, that means everything. The 2 families stayed in contact, German and British, descendants of men who'd been guard and prisoner, united by a story of mercy in wartime. That's the real legacy of men like Friedrich Weber and Daniel Davies. Not the battles they fought, or the victories they won, but the small acts of kindness they extended to each other. The refusal to hate when hatred was expected. The recognition of shared humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Weber had expected brutality when he arrived in Britain in 1916, expected torture and execution, expected to be treated as less than human. Instead, he found himself in a system that, while imperfect, tried to follow the rules, that fed prisoners adequately, that provided medical care, that allowed mail and Red Cross visits, that treated POWs as human beings deserving of basic dignity. This shouldn't have been extraordinary. These were just the requirements of the Geneva Convention. But compared to what Weber had expected, compared to the propaganda he'd believed, it seemed miraculous. And that small miracle, that gap between feared brutality and experienced decency, changed him forever. He'd gone to war as a patriot, returned as a skeptic, lived the rest of his life trying to tell people that enemies were just people, that war was waste, that the simple stories we tell ourselves about good and evil are usually lies. Most people didn't listen, but a few did, and those few carried the message forward, passed it to their children, created tiny ripples of doubt in the grand narratives of nationalism and heroic violence. That's all Weber could do. Tell his truth. Hope someone heard it. Trust that small acts of mercy matter, even when they seem futile against the machinery of war. The question he'd asked himself in that prison camp in 1916, what had any of it been for, never got a satisfying answer. The war achieved nothing worth the cost. Millions died. Empires fell. Another war became inevitable. But there was this. For a few years, in camps across Britain, enemy soldiers discovered they were human beings to each other. Guards and prisoners who could have been cruel chose kindness instead. Small acts of mercy happened in circumstances that should have made them impossible. And those small acts mattered. Not in grand historical terms. The war went on. Hatreds persisted. Nothing changed at the level of nations and politics. But for individuals, for men like Weber, who experienced unexpected humanity from their enemies, everything changed. Their understanding of war, of patriotism, of the lines we draw between us and them, was forever altered. That's the story that needs to be told. Not just the battles and the casualties and the strategic failures, but the quieter story of enemies who became something other than enemies, who discovered, in prison camps and work details and moments of small kindness, that the line between friend and foe is thinner than propaganda suggests. Friedrich Weber expected brutality, found decency, and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. We're still trying to understand it, still trying to reconcile the fact that human beings are capable of both tremendous cruelty and unexpected mercy, that the same species that builds concentration camps also builds Geneva Conventions, that individuals can choose kindness even when systems demand hatred. Weber's story offers no easy answers, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, evidence that kindness is possible even in the worst circumstances, that seeing the enemy as human is a choice we can make, that small acts of mercy matter, even when, especially when, the world is drowning in violence. Remember Friedrich Weber. Remember Corporal Davies. Remember the thousands of guards and prisoners who chose humanity over hatred in the prison camps of World War I. Remember that they were just men, doing the best they could in terrible circumstances, that their small acts of kindness changed individual lives, even if they couldn't stop the war. Remember that we face similar choices every day, maybe not about prisoners and guards, but about how we see those we're told are our enemies, how we treat those who are different from us, whether we choose hatred or humanity when both options are available. The lesson of Weber's story isn't that war is good or prison camps are pleasant. It's that even in war, even in prison camps, humanity persists. And that persistence matters. It matters because it gives us hope, shows us that we're not prisoners of our worst impulses, that we can choose differently, that small acts of mercy, multiplied across thousands of individual choices, can create something that looks almost like grace. Thank you for listening to this story, for bearing witness to these complicated truths about war and humanity and the strange spaces between enemy and friend. Remember them. Remember that the line between us and them is thinner than we think. Remember that enemies are just people. Remember that kindness is always a choice, even when circumstances make it difficult. Remember Friedrich Weber, who expected brutality and found decency, and let that change him for the rest of his life. May we all be so changed.